They ask him about that, and they also ask if they would be allowed to have dances, which is very interesting and a bit cryptic because it's not clear to me yet, and I don't know if it ever will be, whether they mean dances in the mode we would think it would be, in a Western kind of style, or whether they, in fact, are asking if they could do traditional dances, which is particularly intriguing as an ethno-historian because there may be some connection between dancing and healing the sick. Parents write, elders have things to say. Another of my favorite letters is from a parent who writes to a later superintendent complaining about the treatment that his daughter is receiving at school. In particular, he uses this line that says, "I didn't send her there to be an Irish washerwoman. She's an Indian, and we've been kicked all over the country, and we are guaranteed this education, and, by God, she's going to get it." Red Wolf, I gave you his quote, teach my people in the right way, and don't abuse them. There are a number of autobiographies that have come out of this period, or even later. Say, if we think into about the end of the assimilation period at 1930, there are arguably a couple hundred of these. They show both pro and con aspects of the school. So again, we have some contradictory kinds of evidence in terms of what the narrative really is. We can ask what kind of education this was. Was it always going to remain remedial? Was it therefore geared towards only keeping Indians in the bottom levels or on the lower rungs of the ladder of society's stratification? But at the same time, Indians are making inroads. Indians are putting pressures. This is limited, what they can do, especially at first. But with time, they find the footholds to be able to do that. So by the 1920s, you have an Ella Deloria teaching at Haskell. By the 1930s, you have a Henry Rocloud as the first Indian superintendent. As Indians become re-educated or take what they want, what they can use from this education, the use of English, the ability to understand what treaty obligations say they are due, the understanding of the wrongs that have been done to them in the past, they are able to then use those as tools to further their own needs and put pressures on the schools, particularly with a greater Indian presence, both in the schools themselves and up through the Bureau, up through the Office of Indian Affairs. Memories, the final aspect of the conference themes. There are obviously a lot of pretty horrible aspects to what school life was like. It's very hard to imagine those young children, what it would have been like for them to cry themselves to sleep at night, away from their parents and everything that was familiar to them. Disease is rampant. Death is a common feature of school. Discipline. Very early, out of Pratt's model, the military regimen is imposed on Haskell. Another panoramic shot. I had to clip it to get it all there, but you see, these military-style cadet uniforms. There are boys in about 1890 in a cadet formation. Battalion groups are how the students are arranged. Again, and that's that building I showed you earlier as well. This is the school jail that was established in the 1880s. It's no longer on campus, thank God, but I don't know, maybe it would be a good reminder of the sacrifice. Built by Colonel Arthur Grabowski, the second superintendent at Haskell, who was very harsh in his treatment of his charges. And Indians reacted. They ran away in greater numbers. They complained, and they, by doing these things, were actually able to get him removed. So they did have some ability to change the system even from the very early times. This is the jail in happier times. You can see it's overgrown, it's been barred off, you can no longer get in there, and the students there seem to have almost a picnic-like atmosphere in their faces as they sit there in front of it. And of course the graveyard again, pretty damning evidence of a total institution and of a place that had a lot of negatives associated with it. You can also find a lot of really good memories, and I mentioned a couple. Lucille Winnie wrote a book called Sagandio, the Chief's Daughter. She went on to be an educator, as did Elizabeth White or Polangesi Koyama, is her Navajo name. They found the things that were positive in school life. Now, you could say memory is a tricky thing, and as you look back, maybe you want to focus on what was better than what was worse, but I think their message finally is that they were able to take some very useful skills from this education that propelled them forward in life, and both of them, of course, went on to be teachers within the Indian school system, and then to educate other Indians. I mentioned Michael C. Coleman, who is not an Indian, but has collected, I think, a rather wonderful series of autobiographical remembrances in his book American Indian Children at School, 1850 to 1930. This book is about 20 years old, but I think it's still really useful and a good one for anybody who wants to kind of have an introduction to this period. I have my students reading it this semester. He looks at about 100 autobiographies from all across the spectrum: day schools, reservation boarding schools, and non-reservation schools, and that's sort of where he begins. How do we align these contradictory bits of information? That these are pretty awful places to be, but at the same time, students, in looking back, seem to find something positive in them. And I picked this picture, which is the closest I could get you to the farm, because I think it's nice. It's a happy moment in the midst of sometimes that aren't very happy. So how do we reconcile those? One of the things that I've been asking, I ask of myself, I ask of my students, I challenge you to think about it, is, the historiography is changing, and I hope I'm one of the people that's helping that historiography to change. In moving away from seeing Indians purely as victims of this system, it's easy to do that. But when we think about that graveyard, when we think about what students were doing with all of their various societies, literary and musical and dramatic and et cetera, on the Haskell campus in the 1890s, in a time when warfare is no distant memory, at a time when parents who visit the campus are shocked to see their children dressed up like little soldiers of the army that many of them had just got done fighting not very far before. It's, when we think about that, and we think about what my colleague, Dr. Teresa Milk at Haskell says, they didn't have time to be victims. They were working towards furthering their own people, ultimately. So they were active agents. They were historical actors. And I think historiography and history is beginning to change in that direction. The red progressives make a great example, the so-called red progressives. That's probably politically incorrect a little bit today, but they're still often referred to as that. So the Charles Eastmans, the Carlos Montezumas, the Zika Lassa or Gertrude Bonin, her Western name, people who were products of the boarding school system and came out of that, Montezuma and Eastman and Susan Picotte LaFlèche were medical doctors. They decided to go back into Indian education, in particular, to try and change the system from within. And they stood as real role models for other students, not only to, as the outsider would say, to show what an Indian can do, but to exemplify that ability to adapt. Because every one of them, even after having their traditional identity damn near beaten out of them, went back to reclaim it and to try and strengthen it for others. And if we think about them as examples again, you know, there are some real positives that come out of the re-education experience. And my students say it today because I make them, I'm Haskell students, I try and get them to think about that. And they come up with those things on their own. Well, yeah, it was a good thing that we learned English. We could read the treaties now. We could understand what's owed to us, you know, or what went wrong. You know, yeah, it's a good thing that, you know, some of our people learned how to be doctors or lawyers or activists, etc. You know, yeah, it's a great thing that Haskell still exists. Well, the mission is completely different than what it was. I mean, now we celebrate the diversity, the vibrancy, the survival of tribal entities. But we don't forget what its origins were. Okay, thank you very much.